What happens when a strict police officer wrongly arrests an innocent child? Officer Grant Thorne, known for his tough approach, makes a life-altering mistake when he handcuffs a young boy without a second thought. But just 15 minutes later, the truth hits hard, and the entire community turns against him. As his career and reputation crumble, Grant faces a choice. Will he cling to his pride or fight for redemption in the most unexpected way? This heartwarming story of second chances will leave you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss it. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban streets of Springfield Pines, giving everything a warm, almost nostalgic feel. It was a typical summer day, children riding bikes, neighbors chatting by their front lawns, and the occasional hum of a lawnmower in the distance. But for Officer Grant Thorne, there was no room for nostalgia. His eyes scanned the streets with a hawk-like precision, the weight of his badge pressing heavily on his chest as he steered the patrol car slowly down Maple Avenue. The neighborhood may look peaceful, he thought, but that's when you have to be most alert. Grant's jaw tightened as he turned to his younger partner, Neil Kramer, who was fiddling with his radio. Neil was new, eager, a bit too green for Grant's liking. He hadn't yet developed the hardened instincts that years on the force had given Grant. Grant glanced at Neil, his expression stern. "You've got to stay sharp, Kramer," he muttered, a hint of irritation in his voice. "This is when people get complacent. That's when trouble happens." Neil nodded quickly, trying to hide his nervousness. "Yes, sir. I'm just adjusting the radio." Grant grunted in response, shifting his gaze back to the road. As they approached the corner of Evergreen Market, he noticed a boy standing alone outside the store's entrance. The kid couldn't have been more than 11 or 12, with a mop of curly hair and big brown eyes that darted nervously around. He clutched a small bouquet of flowers tightly in his hands, the kind you'd buy from the discount rack at the grocery store. Grant's eyes narrowed. "What's he doing there?" he murmured, more to himself than to Neil. Neil looked up, spotting the boy. "Maybe he's just waiting for someone," he suggested, his tone casual. But Grant wasn't convinced. "You see that look on his face?" he said, his voice low and clipped. "He's up to something. No one stands around like that unless they're planning something." Neil hesitated. He didn't see anything particularly unusual about the boy, just a kid holding flowers, probably for his mom or grandma. But he'd learned early on not to question Grant's instincts. The older officer had a reputation for being tough, strict, and, most importantly, rarely wrong. "Let's check it out," Grant decided, pulling the car to the curb. He stepped out, adjusting his belt, and squinting against the sun as he crossed the street with long, purposeful strides. The boy looked up as Grant's shadow loomed over him. His wide eyes met Grant's for a brief second before flickering away, like a deer caught in headlights. He clutched the bouquet even tighter, almost as if it were a lifeline. "Hey, kid," Grant called out, his voice rough, but not yet unkind. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, his fingers curling around the stems of the flowers. "Zeke," he stammered. "Zeke Daniels." Grant folded his arms, giving Zeke a once-over. "What are you doing here, Zeke? Waiting for someone?" Zeke nodded quickly, his eyes darting towards the store entrance. "I'm waiting for my grandma. She's inside shopping. I just wanted to get her some flowers," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Grant raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the crumpled bouquet. "Flowers, huh?" He didn't bother hiding the skepticism in his voice. "That's nice of you, but it's a little odd for a kid your age to be hanging around out here alone." Zeke's face fell slightly, as if he could sense the suspicion in Grant's tone. "I'm just waiting," he repeated, more firmly this time. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But Grant wasn't convinced. He had seen this look before. Kids pretending to be innocent, only to run off the moment your back was turned. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lower, more authoritative tone. "You got a receipt for those flowers?" he asked, nodding towards the bouquet. Zeke blinked, taken aback. "A receipt?" he echoed. "I bought them inside, I swear. My grandma gave me money." Grant felt his patience slipping. "I'm not asking for your life story, kid. I'm asking if you have proof you paid for those flowers," he snapped. Neil, who had been watching from a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably. "Grant, maybe we should just wait for his grandmother," he started. But Grant cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "This isn't about waiting, Kramer. It's about enforcing the rules." He turned back to Zeke, who was now visibly trembling, clutching the flowers like they were a shield. A small crowd had started to gather, sensing the tension. A woman stepped forward. Tara Myers, a local schoolteacher. She recognized Zeke immediately and called out, "Officer, is there a problem here? That's Zeke. He's one of my students." Grant's eyes flicked to Tara, but he didn't soften. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said curtly. "This kid looks like he might be up to something." Tara's expression turned to one of disbelief. "He's waiting for his grandmother. He's a good boy. You're making a mistake." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, recording the scene. Neil could feel the unease building, but Grant seemed oblivious, his focus locked onto Zeke. "Empty your pockets," Grant ordered, stepping closer. Zeke's eyes widened with shock. "I didn't steal anything," he cried, his voice breaking. "Please, I just bought these for my grandma." But Grant wasn't listening. He grabbed Zeke's wrist, twisting it behind his back, as he snapped on the handcuffs. The crowd gasped, a few people shouting out in protest. "This is wrong," Tara yelled, stepping forward, but Neil held her back gently. "Let's just wait and see," Neil said, though his voice lacked conviction. Tears streamed down Zeke's cheeks as he looked up at Grant, his voice pleading. "Please, sir. I didn't do anything wrong. My grandma, she's right inside." But Grant's face remained stony, unmoved. "Save it, kid," he muttered. "You can explain yourself at the station." Just then, a woman burst out of the store, her face a mask of panic. It was Marcy Daniels, her arms still laden with grocery bags. The moment her eyes locked onto Zeke, she dropped everything and ran towards him, her voice filled with desperation. "What are you doing to my grandson?" she screamed, shoving through the crowd. Grant turned to face her, his expression hard. "Ma'am, step back. Your grandson has been caught stealing." Marcy's face contorted with shock and anger. "Stealing? He bought those flowers. I gave him the money myself," she cried, reaching for Zeke. Grant held up a hand to block her, his voice icy. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." But Marcy was anything but calm. She looked at Zeke, seeing the tears streaming down his face, the handcuffs biting into his small wrists. "You're hurting him," she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. "He's just a child." The crowd had grown larger, their murmurs turning into shouts of outrage. Neil looked at Grant, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Grant, maybe we should—" "We're done here," Grant interrupted, pushing Zeke towards the patrol car. "Let's go." As he opened the back door, the sound of a loud, clear voice cut through the chaos. "Wait, I have proof." Everyone turned to see Luis Alvarez, the store owner, holding up a crumpled receipt. "The boy paid for those flowers," he shouted. "He's innocent." Grant froze, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. He looked down at Zeke, who was still crying, and then back at the crowd, their eyes filled with anger and judgment. His heart pounded in his chest, a sinking feeling of dread beginning to take hold. In that moment he knew he had made a terrible mistake. A tense silence filled the air as the crowd around Evergreen Market seemed to hold its collective breath. Officer Grant Thorne stood frozen, his hands still gripping the door of the patrol car, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Luis Alvarez, the owner of the market, had just presented a crumpled receipt proving that Zeke Daniels, the trembling boy in handcuffs, had paid for the flowers. The very flowers that now lay crushed on the sidewalk, trampled by the chaos of the moment. Grant glanced down at Zeke, whose tear-streaked face looked up at him with a mix of fear, confusion, and something else, a deep, unspoken hurt. It was the kind of look that struck right to the core, a look Grant hadn't seen in years, not since his own childhood. But he pushed the thought away, tightening his grip on Zeke's arm. "Step back, everyone," Grant barked, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice, usually so authoritative, wavered slightly. The crowd, however, wasn't backing down. They were filming, shouting, and pointing, their expressions a mix of disbelief and growing anger. Tara Myers, the school teacher who knew Zeke well, pushed through the mass of onlookers. Her face was flushed with indignation as she faced Grant. "This is wrong, officer. You need to let him go right now," she demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. Grant's eyes flashed with irritation. He was used to dealing with angry citizens, but this felt different, more personal, more intense. "Ma'am, step aside," he ordered, his tone sharper than intended. "You're interfering with a police investigation." "Interfering?" Tara scoffed, gesturing to Zeke. "He's just a child who did nothing wrong." Behind her, Neil Kramer, Grant's partner, shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into him, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a heavy stone. Neil had never seen Grant like this, so sure of himself, yet so stubbornly blind. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Just then, a voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. "This isn't justice. This is profiling." The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers swelling into a wave of disapproval. Someone shouted, "This is what happens when you assume things about a black kid standing outside a store." Another person added, "It's 2024, and we're still dealing with this kind of nonsense." Grant's face reddened. He could feel control slipping through his fingers like sand. He looked back at Luis, who was still holding the receipt in the air, as if it were a flag of truce. "I saw the whole thing," Luis said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This boy came in, bought the flowers and left. He didn't steal anything." For a fleeting moment, Grant hesitated. The logical part of his brain told him to stop, to take a breath, and reassess the situation. But his pride, his deep-seated belief in his own judgment, wouldn't let him back down. He clenched his jaw, glancing at Neil, searching for a sign of support. Neil looked back, his expression pained, as if he wanted to speak up, but couldn't find the courage. "Grant," Neil finally said, his voice low but urgent, "we need to listen to them. This isn't right." Grant whipped his head around to face Neil, his eyes narrowing. "Are you questioning me, Kramer?" he snapped, his voice laced with disbelief. Neil swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. He could see the lines being drawn, not just between Grant and the crowd, but between himself and his partner. "Yes, I am," Neil said quietly, his voice firmer than before. "We need to let the boy go." The crowd fell silent, stunned by the young officer's defiance. Grant's face twisted into a scowl. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Marcy Daniels pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her voice was like a thunderclap, cutting through the tension. "You put my grandson in handcuffs for no reason." Grant turned to face her, and for the first time he faltered. Marcy was a formidable presence, her expression a mix of raw pain and fury. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, trembling slightly. "He's a good boy," she continued, her voice cracking. "He doesn't deserve this. You need to take those handcuffs off him right now." Grant hesitated, the anger and defiance draining from his face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced back at Zeke, who was crying silently, his small body shaking with each sob. For a long, painful moment, Grant said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the key to the handcuffs. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief as he stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs, letting them fall to the ground with a heavy metallic clink. Zeke pulled his hands to his chest, rubbing his sore wrists as he looked up at Grant. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, wounded sadness that seemed far too old for a boy his age. "I'm sorry," Zeke whispered, almost inaudibly. Grant's head snapped up, a look of shock crossing his face. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry," Zeke repeated, wiping at his tears. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The words hit Grant like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. He just stood there, staring at the boy in front of him, feeling a wave of guilt and shame wash over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, one he had forgotten he was even capable of. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the tension hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Marcy took Zeke's hand, pulling him into a tight hug. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, her voice choked with tears. "I'm here now. Let's go home." As Marcy and Zeke started to walk away, Grant felt an overwhelming urge to say something, anything to make it right. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Ma'am, he began, but Marcy cut him off with a look that could have frozen water. "Don't," she said simply, her voice cold and distant. "You've done enough." Neil placed a hand on Grant's shoulder, pulling him back gently. "Let it go, Grant," he said softly. "You made a mistake. Let them leave." Grant let out a shuddering breath, his shoulders slumping. He watched as Marcy led Zeke down the sidewalk, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. They disappeared around the corner, leaving Grant standing there, alone and uncertain for the first time in years. The sound of a phone buzzing snapped Grant out of his daze. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. It was a message from the station, a direct order to return immediately. His stomach twisted into a knot as he realized what this meant. Neil looked at him, his expression a mix of pity and disappointment. "The chief's going to want to talk to you about this," he said quietly. Grant nodded numbly, shoving his phone back into his pocket. He didn't say another word as he climbed into the patrol car, slamming the door shut behind him. Neil got in on the other side, the silence between them thick and heavy. As they drove back to the station, Grant stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Springfield Pines pass by. But they didn't look the same anymore. It was as if the entire town had changed in an instant, its warm, welcoming facade replaced by something colder, more hostile. For the first time in his career, Grant felt like an outsider in his own community. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, but there was no one there to answer. The ride back to the station felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Grant's mind raced, replaying the incident over and over, each detail standing out in sharp, painful clarity. He had seen Zeke's tears, heard the tremble in Marcy's voice, felt the weight of Neil's disapproval. And now, he couldn't shake the image of Zeke's small, terrified face from his mind. When they pulled into the station parking lot, Neil turned off the engine and sat back, letting out a slow breath. He looked over at Grant, his expression softer now, tinged with something like sympathy. "Grant," he began quietly, "I know you were just trying to do your job. But this wasn't right. You have to see that." Grant didn't respond. He couldn't. He just nodded once, staring straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Neil sighed, opening his door. "Come on," he said, We'd better go inside. Grant nodded again, but he didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the station entrance, the familiar building that had once felt like a second home. Now, it looked like a fortress, cold, imposing, and unwelcoming. What have I become? He thought, the realization crashing over him like a wave. He had wanted to protect this community, to keep it safe. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what that truly meant. And now he feared it might be too late to make things right. The sound of the station door slamming behind him echoed through the silence of the precinct. Officer Grant Thorne strode through the hallway, his steps heavy, as if the weight of the day's events clung to his ankles, like chains. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues following him, curious, judgmental, and filled with an unspoken question. What happened out there? Grant's chest tightened with each step. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. The tension wasn't coming from a dangerous suspect or a high-stakes chase. It was rooted deep in his own chest, like a splinter he couldn't ignore. He reached his desk, slumping into his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. His mind replayed the incident at the market, each moment sharper, more painful than before. The look in Zeke Daniels' eyes as he was handcuffed, the horrified gasps from the crowd, the icy rage in Marcy Daniels' voice. I was just doing my job, Grant muttered under his breath. But the words felt hollow. Before he could even pick up a pen to lose himself in paperwork, a voice called from across the room. It was stern, familiar, and edged with irritation. Officer Thorne, in my office, now. Grant's head snapped up. Standing by the door to her office was Captain Emily Reed, her face a mask of restrained fury. Grant pushed himself up from his chair, feeling the eyes of his fellow officers boring into his back as he made his way over. He stepped inside, the door closing with a quiet but firm click behind him. Captain Reed wasted no time. She tossed a tablet onto the desk in front of him. The screen was lit up with a video, grainy, but unmistakable. It was footage from the market, showing Grant handcuffing Zeke. The crowd's shouts of protest growing louder in the background. Grant's own voice could be heard, cold and commanding. I'm just doing my job. This is bad, Grant, Captain Reed said, her voice low, but filled with a controlled anger. This video is already going viral. We've received dozens of complaints, and there's a formal accusation of racial profiling. What the hell happened out there? Grant felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt dry, like sandpaper. Captain, he began, his voice strained. I thought the boy was stealing. He was acting suspicious. Suspicious? Captain Reed cut him off, her eyes narrowing. He was holding flowers, Grant, flowers. The store owner provided a receipt, and multiple witnesses, including a teacher, vouched for the boy. You didn't even stop to consider it, did you? Grant opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like a child being scolded by a parent, the raw shame mixing with the defensiveness that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. I followed procedure, he managed to say, though his voice lacked conviction. Captain Reed's eyes flashed, with something between disappointment and fury. She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the desk. Your procedure, she said, her voice icy, has landed us in a public relations nightmare. The community is outraged, and frankly I can't blame them. You didn't follow up. You didn't ask questions. You just assumed. Grant clenched his fists, feeling the sting of her words like a slap across the face. I've been doing this job for 20 years, he shot back, his voice rising. I know when someone's up to no good. That boy looked nervous, like he was hiding something. Nervous, Captain Reed repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Of course he was nervous, Grant. He was an 11-year-old boy, standing alone, confronted by a cop, twice his size. Did it ever occur to you that maybe he was scared of you? Not because he was guilty, but because you were intimidating him? Grant felt his face flush with anger, a hot wave that swept over him. So now it's my fault for doing my job, he snapped. I can't win here, can I? This isn't about winning, Reed shot back, her voice steely. This is about justice. And right now, you're looking like the kind of officer who jumps to conclusions based on a kid's skin color. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Grant's heart pounded in his chest, the echo of Reed's words ringing in his ears. Racial profiling. It was a term he had heard before, a term he had dismissed as something other officers were guilty of. Never him. He prided himself on treating everyone the same, on his strict, no-nonsense approach. But now, that approach was being questioned in a way that made his skin crawl. Captain Reed straightened up, letting out a slow, measured breath. You're suspended, effective immediately, she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Turn in your badge and your gun. There will be a formal investigation. Grant's mouth fell open in shock. Suspended? But. No buts, Grant, she snapped. You've crossed a line, and now you're going to face the consequences. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Slowly, almost robotically, he reached down, unhooking his badge and setting it on the desk with a heavy clink. His gun followed, the weight of it leaving his belt, feeling strangely light, almost as if he were naked without it. I'll fight this, Grant muttered, his voice low but defiant. I did what I thought was right. Reed's expression softened just a fraction, her anger giving way to something almost like pity. Maybe that's the problem, Grant, she said quietly. You're so convinced you're always right that you don't even see the harm you're causing. Grant didn't respond. He turned and left the office, feeling the eyes of his colleagues on him once more as he made his way to the exit. He didn't look at any of them. He couldn't. The shame was too great, the sting of humiliation too sharp. He stepped out into the sunlight, but it felt colder than before. The warmth of the day had vanished, replaced by a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. He walked to his car, each step feeling heavier than the last, until he finally reached the driver's seat. He sat there, staring at the steering wheel, his hands trembling slightly. I was just doing my job, he whispered, the words hollow even to his own ears. He couldn't go home. Not yet. The thought of sitting in his empty apartment, with nothing but his own thoughts for company, was unbearable. Instead, he started the car and drove aimlessly. The familiar streets of Springfield Pines passing by in a blur. He had spent years patrolling these streets, knowing every corner, every alleyway. But now they felt foreign, as if he were driving through a place he had never seen before. Eventually, he found himself parked outside the Springfield Community Center, a place he hadn't visited in years. It was a hub of activity, a place where kids came to play and families gathered for events. He could see people inside, laughing, chatting, completely oblivious to the turmoil churning inside him. What am I even doing here? He muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. But before he could turn the key and drive away, the front door of the community center opened, and out stepped Reverend Calvin Brooks. The Reverend was an older man, with a kind face lined with the creases of 1,000 smiles. He was well known in the community, a beacon of hope and wisdom for many. Reverend Brooks spotted Grant sitting in his car, and his smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of concern. He made his way over, tapping gently on the window. Grant hesitated, then rolled it down. Officer Thorne, the Reverend greeted him warmly. It's been a while. What brings you here today? Grant shrugged, looking away. Just needed to clear my head, he muttered. The Reverend studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if he understood more than Grant was saying. "Why don't you come inside?" he suggested. "We're just finishing up the lunch service. Could use an extra pair of hands." Grant opened his mouth to refuse, to make up some excuse, but the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself nodding, stepping out of the car, and following the Reverend inside. The warmth of the community center hit him like a wave, the sound of laughter and conversation filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of the police station. Grant felt out of place, like a soldier stepping into a field of wildflowers. "This way," Reverend Brooks said, leading him towards a row of tables where volunteers were handing out food to a line of people. Grant could see Marcy Daniels near the front, ladling soup into bowls with a practiced hand. Zeke was beside her, his face still pale, but a small, hesitant smile on his lips as he handed out napkins. The sight of them hit Grant like a physical blow, his chest tightening with a painful squeeze of guilt. He took a deep breath, bracing himself. He had wanted to clear his head, but now he realized he was about to face the very people he had wronged. The noise of the bustling Springfield Community Center seemed to fade into the background as Officer Grant Thorne stepped through the entrance. He could feel the warmth of the room washing over him. Children laughing, families chatting, the clinking of utensils as volunteers served meals. It was a stark contrast to the frigid tension that had settled deep within his chest. He hesitated by the door, feeling like an intruder in a space filled with such genuine, unguarded joy. Grant's eyes scanned the room, and they landed on Marcy Daniels at the serving table, her hands deftly ladling soup into bowls with a practiced rhythm. Beside her was Zeke, looking more relaxed now, his small hands carefully placing napkins on each tray. The boy's face, still pale from the ordeal earlier that day, held a fragile, hesitant smile as he glanced up at the people passing by. For a brief moment, Zeke's eyes met Grant's across the room. The smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear and a hurt that hit Grant like a punch to the gut. Grant swallowed hard, feeling his heart thud against his ribs. He wanted to turn around and leave, to escape the weight of his own guilt. But then Reverend Calvin Brooks appeared at his side, his gentle voice cutting through the whirlwind of Grant's thoughts. "You look like a man with a heavy burden, Officer Thorne," Reverend Brooks said softly. His eyes, filled with a mix of empathy and knowing, seemed to peer straight into the turmoil roiling inside Grant. Grant forced a smile, but it felt more like a grimace. "Just here to help," he mumbled, though the words felt hollow. Reverend Brooks nodded knowingly. "Help is always welcome here," he replied, gesturing towards the serving line. "We could use another pair of hands. Why don't you start by passing out the bread?" Grant hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the volunteers on him, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond. "Isn't that the officer from the video? What's he doing here?" The murmurs were like static in his ears, grating and persistent. But he nodded, moving stiffly towards the table, picking up a basket of freshly baked rolls. As he stepped into the serving line, he was painfully aware of how out of place he looked, still in his uniform, though stripped of his badge and gun. The fabric felt tighter, almost suffocating, as if it were squeezing the breath out of him. He forced himself to focus on the task, placing a roll on each tray, avoiding eye contact with the people in line. "Thank you," a soft voice said, and Grant looked up, startled. It was a young mother, her face lined with exhaustion, but softened by a small, grateful smile. She held the hand of a little girl, who peered up at Grant with wide, curious eyes. Grant nodded, managing a tight smile. "You're welcome," he muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. He continued down the line, each thank you feeling like a small balm on the raw wound of his conscience. But the relief was fleeting. As he approached the end of the table, he found himself face to face with Marcy Daniels. Marcy's expression was unreadable, a carefully crafted mask that gave away nothing. Her hands paused mid-motion, the ladle dripping hot soup back into the pot as she looked at Grant. The silence between them stretched, heavy and taut, pulling the attention of those around them like a magnet. "Marcy," Grant began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying again. I wanted to—" "You shouldn't be here," Marcy interrupted, her voice low but sharp, like a knife slicing through the air. Grant flinched, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, hurt, and a deep, raw pain that he had caused. "I'm here to make things right," he managed to say, though the words felt weak and insubstantial. Marcy's laugh was bitter, a harsh sound that made Zeke flinch beside her. "Make things right?" she repeated, shaking her head. "You think handing out bread is going to make up for what you did to my grandson today?" Grant felt the heat rise to his face, a flush of shame that burned hotter than the soup steaming in the pot. He glanced down at Zeke, who was staring at the floor, his small hands clenched into fists. "I made a mistake," Grant said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was the first time he'd admitted it out loud, and the words felt like they were being dragged out of him. "I was wrong, Marcy. I should have listened. Marcy held up her hand, stopping him. "You don't get to apologize here," she snapped. "Not like this. Not while you're still in that uniform, still standing there like nothing's changed." The silence that followed was deafening. Grant felt the eyes of the entire room on him now, the collective weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear, and escape the crushing reality of his own actions. But then, Reverend Brooks stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Marcy's arm. "Marcy," he said softly, his voice a soothing balm. "Maybe this is a start. Maybe it's not enough, but it's something." Marcy's jaw clenched, and for a moment it looked like she might argue. But then she looked at Zeke, saw the way he was biting his lip, trying to hold back tears, and she let out a long, shuddering breath. "Fine," she said, her voice brittle. "You can stay, but if you're really here to help, then act like it. Stop standing there feeling sorry for yourself." Grant nodded, the words hitting him like a slap. "I will," he said quietly, and for the first time he meant it. He spent the next few hours working alongside the volunteers, his movements mechanical but purposeful. He mopped floors, scrubbed tables, and carried heavy boxes without complaint. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't try to make small talk or offer explanations. He just worked, letting the rhythm of the tasks drown out the noise in his head. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor, the crowd in the community center started to thin out. Families gathered their things, children clutching leftover snacks as they followed their parents out the door. Grant wiped sweat from his brow, looking around the now empty room with a strange sense of relief. He spotted Marcy and Zeke near the exit, the boy clinging to his grandmother's side. Zeke looked up at Grant, his expression hesitant but less fearful than before. Grant took a deep breath and stepped towards them, feeling like he was walking through thick mud. "Marcy," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. I was wrong today, and I can't take it back, but I want to do better." Marcy stared at him for a long moment, her face inscrutable. Then she turned to Zeke, her voice gentler. "Zeke, honey, do you want to say anything?" Zeke's lower lip quivered as he looked up at Grant. "Why did you think I was bad?" he asked in a small voice. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." The question was simple, but it struck Grant like a hammer to the chest. He crouched down, so he was at eye level with Zeke, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. I don't know, Grant admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong, Zeke. I let my own fears and biases get in the way. I didn't see you for who you are, and I'm so sorry for that. Zeke's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded slowly, as if he were processing the words. He took a step closer, hesitated, then wrapped his small arms around Grant's neck in a quick, tight hug. It's okay, Zeke whispered. Just don't do it again. Grant hugged him back, feeling the dam inside him break. He nodded, pulling away and looking up at Marcy. Her expression had softened, just a fraction, but it was enough. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice still laced with pain, but carrying a hint of reluctant acceptance. But words aren't enough, Officer Thorne. You've got a lot to prove. Grant nodded, standing up slowly. I know, he said, and I will. As they walked out the door, Grant felt a strange, fragile sense of hope fluttering in his chest. He had lost his badge, his sense of authority, and his certainty about who he was as an officer. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to find something better. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver light across the quiet streets of Springfield Pines. Officer Grant Thorne stood on the porch of his small, modest home, staring out into the stillness. The events of the day replayed in his mind on a relentless loop. Zeke's tears, Marcy's hardened glare, the whispers of the crowd, and the sting of his own suspension. For years, this uniform had defined him, had given him purpose. But tonight, as he removed his badge and set it down on the porch railing, it felt like a shackle that he was finally unbuckling. He let out a long, shuddering breath and sank down onto the porch steps, burying his face in his hands. The emptiness he felt wasn't just about the loss of his badge. It was the realization that he had become something he once despised. A cop who saw only what he wanted to see, who made snap judgments and never stopped to consider the person behind the suspicion. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out slowly, half expecting it to be another call from the station, perhaps even Chief Reed, telling him it was all a mistake. But it wasn't the station. It was a message from Reverend Calvin Brooks. Community meeting at the center tomorrow. You should come. Grant's initial instinct was to ignore it, to retreat into the safety of his home and lick his wounds. But something stopped him. He read the message again, this time hearing the unspoken offer beneath the words. It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. I'll be there, he texted back, though his fingers trembled as he typed. He knew this meeting wasn't just a chance to apologize. It was an opportunity to face the community he had wronged, to step into the heart of the storm he had created. The next evening, the Springfield Community Center was packed. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, but people were standing along the walls, filling every available space. The air buzzed with a low hum of murmured conversations, punctuated by the occasional sharp laugh or whispered remark. Grant hovered near the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the familiar faces. Marcy Daniels, her lips pressed into a thin line. Zeke, clutching a small stuffed animal tightly to his chest. Tara Myers, the school teacher who had been the first to speak up against him. And dozens of others he had encountered over the years on his patrols. People he thought he knew, but now realized he had never truly seen. You came, a voice said quietly beside him. Grant turned to see Reverend Brooks, his kind eyes studying Grant's face. Grant nodded, swallowing hard. I wasn't sure I should, he admitted. It's not going to be easy, the Reverend replied, his tone gentle but firm. But this is where the healing starts. He placed a hand on Grant's shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze before stepping to the front of the room, raising his hands for silence. Thank you all for coming, Reverend Brooks began, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. We're here tonight because something happened that shook this community. We've all seen the video. and we've all felt the pain it caused. But we're also here because we believe in second chances, in the possibility of change. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Grant felt every eye turn towards him, 100 silent accusations that made his skin prickle with discomfort. He forced himself to stand tall, even as he felt like shrinking into the shadows. Reverend Brooks continued, "Tonight we're going to have an open discussion, a chance for us all to speak honestly, to share our hurt, our anger, and our hopes. And I'm going to start by inviting Officer Grant Thorne to the front." Grant's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected to be called up so soon. He glanced around, searching for an escape, but there was none. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, the murmurs in the room growing louder as he made his way to the front. He stood there, feeling naked without his badge, without the authority that usually shielded him. He cleared his throat, but the words he had rehearsed all night seemed to vanish, leaving only raw, unfiltered truth. I made a terrible mistake," Grant began, his voice cracking. He forced himself to look at the faces in front of him. Marcy, Zeke, Tara. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I saw Zeke standing outside the store, and I made an assumption. I didn't ask questions, I didn't listen. I was wrong, and I hurt people because of it. He paused, taking a deep breath as he met Marcy's steely gaze. "I'm sorry, Marcy. I'm sorry, Zeke. I know my words can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I'm committed to changing. I'm here tonight because I want to listen. I want to hear your stories, your pain, and I want to learn from it." The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, Grant thought no one would respond, that his apology would hang in the air, unanswered and unwanted. But then Marcy stood up, her face a mask of controlled fury. "You want to listen now?" she said, her voice cold and sharp. "Where was this willingness to listen when you had my grandson in handcuffs? Where was this humility when you accused an innocent child of stealing?" Grant flinched at her words, feeling them like physical blows. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was wrong. I was blind." "Blind?" Marcy snapped, her voice rising. "Or just unwilling to see. You didn't even hesitate, Officer Thorne. You looked at my grandson, and you saw a threat, a child, my child. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Grant felt tears sting the corners of his eyes. He shook his head slowly. "No," he admitted, "I don't. But I want to understand. I need to." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some voices filled with agreement, others with skepticism. It was Tara Myers who spoke next, stepping forward with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We've all seen this before," she said, her voice weary. "An officer makes a mistake, apologizes, promises to change. But nothing really changes, does it? How do we know you're any different?" Grant's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not out of anger, but out of frustration at himself. "I can't ask you to trust me," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "But I can promise you this: I'm going to put in the work. I'm going to show up every day and prove that I've learned from this. I'm going to be here, listening, helping, and trying to be the kind of officer this community deserves." He looked directly at Zeke, who was standing beside Marcy, half hidden behind her skirt. "And Zeke," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want to be someone you can trust again. I know I broke that trust, and it's going to take time to fix it. But I won't give up." Zeke looked up at his grandmother, who nodded slowly. The boy took a small step forward, meeting Grant's eyes. "Will you really try?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Grant dropped to one knee, so he was eye level with Zeke. "Yes, Zeke," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I will. I'll do everything I can to make sure this never happens to you or anyone else again." A silence fell over the room once more, But this time it wasn't filled with anger. It was heavy with a different kind of emotion, a fragile, tentative hope. Reverend Brooks stepped forward, placing a hand on Zeke's shoulder, and then on Grant's. "Change isn't easy," the Reverend said softly. "It's painful, and it takes time. But it starts here, with conversations like this. It starts with honesty, with listening, and with a willingness to be better." The room erupted into a quiet murmur, people nodding, some wiping away tears. Marcy's face softened just a fraction as she looked at Grant. "You've got a long road ahead, Officer Thorne," she said quietly. "But it seems like you're finally willing to walk it." Grant nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I am," he whispered. "I truly am." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Grant felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. It wasn't much, just a flicker, a tiny flame, but it was enough to light the way forward. The weeks following the tense meeting at the Springfield Community Center were some of the hardest of Grant Thorne's life. He no longer had the comfort of his uniform or the authority of his badge. For the first time in years, he was just a man, a flawed, deeply remorseful man, trying to make amends for mistakes he could never truly undo. Every day was a new challenge, a test of his resolve and his willingness to face the consequences of his actions. His mornings now started early, not at the police station but at the community center. He showed up before the sun had even risen, long before the other volunteers arrived. He wanted to prove, to himself, as much as to the people around him, that he wasn't just here to make a token gesture. He was here to put in the work. On a crisp autumn morning, Grant arrived at the center, carrying a box of fresh produce. The air was cool, with a hint of the first frost biting at his nose. He set the box down on the front steps and took a deep breath, looking around at the empty street, the sun just beginning to peek over the rooftops. The quiet moments before the day started had become his refuge, a time to gather his thoughts before he faced the steady stream of wary glances and whispered judgments. As he unlocked the doors and stepped inside, he was greeted by the familiar smells of the center, the faint scent of cleaning supplies, the lingering aroma of yesterday's baked goods, and the fresh, earthy scent of vegetables being prepared for the soup kitchen. Grant had come to know these smells as a sign of progress, a reminder that he was, in some small way, contributing to something good. He made his way to the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves as he entered. Susan, the head of the volunteer team, looked up from her cutting board, her expression a mix of surprise and something like approval. "You're here early, as always," she said, her voice light, but tinged with genuine appreciation. Grant gave her a small, tired smile. "Figured I'd get a head start on the prep," he replied, reaching for a knife. He began chopping onions, the familiar task calming his racing thoughts. Susan watched him for a moment, then leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "You know," she said slowly, "I was one of the people who didn't want you here at first." Grant paused, looking up at her. He appreciated her honesty, even if it stung a bit. "I figured," he said quietly. "Most people didn't." Susan nodded, her expression softening. "But you've proven me wrong," she admitted. "You've shown up every day, worked harder than anyone else. I can see that you're trying, Grant." He let out a slow breath, the words feeling like a small but significant victory. "Thank you," he said simply. They continued to work in companionable silence for a while, chopping vegetables and stirring pots of soup. The steady rhythm of the kitchen was soothing, a welcome distraction from the turmoil that still churned inside him. But that peace was shattered when the door swung open, and in walked Marcy Daniels, with Zeke trailing close behind her. The room seemed to grow colder as Marcy stepped inside, her eyes locking onto Grant's, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Zeke looked up at his grandmother, then back at Grant, his small face filled with a mix of curiosity and lingering fear. "Morning," Marcy said stiffly, her voice clipped. It wasn't exactly a greeting, more of an acknowledgement, but it was the first word she had spoken to him since the night of the community meeting. "Morning," Grant replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He offered a small smile to Zeke, who gave a hesitant nod in return. Susan, sensing the tension, cleared her throat and clapped her hands together. "All right, team," she said brightly. "Let's get started on today's meal service. Grant, could you take the box of canned goods to the pantry? Marcy, I need you at the front desk for a bit." Grant nodded, grateful for the chance to step away and catch his breath. He picked up the heavy box and made his way to the pantry, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the look Marcy had given him, a look that seemed to hold equal parts distrust and reluctant acceptance. As he pushed open the pantry door, he nearly collided with Zeke, who had followed him. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, clutching his stuffed bear, a small, well-loved toy that Grant recognized from the day of the incident. "Hey there, buddy," Grant said softly, crouching down to Zeke's level. "What's up?" Zeke hesitated, shifting from foot to foot. "I wanted to ask you something," he said finally, his voice small and unsure. Grant nodded, his heart aching at the uncertainty in the boy's eyes. "Sure, Zeke," he replied gently. "You can ask me anything." Zeke's brow furrowed, as if he were trying to find the right words. "Why did you think I was a bad kid?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The question struck Grant like a physical blow. He had known this was coming, had expected it even, but hearing it from Zeke's own mouth made it feel like his heart was being squeezed in a vice. "Oh, Zeke," Grant said, his voice cracking. He reached out but stopped himself, unsure if the boy would welcome the gesture. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I let my own fears get in the way of seeing you for who you really are." Zeke's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back stubbornly. "But I didn't do anything," he insisted, his voice tinged with a desperation that broke Grant's heart. "I know," Grant said, his own eyes welling up. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to hold Zeke's gaze. "And I'm so sorry for what I did. You didn't deserve that. You deserve to feel safe, to be treated with kindness. I failed you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Zeke stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "Just don't do it again. To anyone." Grant felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. "I promise, Zeke," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never make that mistake again." Zeke gave him a small, tentative smile, then turned and ran back to the front of the center, where Marcy was waiting. Grant watched him go, feeling a strange, fragile sense of hope bloom in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, the tension between Grant and the community began to thaw. Bit by bit, he continued to show up at the center every day, taking on the toughest tasks without complaint. He helped organize food drives, set up after-school programs, and even started a weekly basketball game with the local kids. The first time he joined the game, the children were hesitant, casting wary glances his way, as if they were unsure what to make of him. But as the ball flew from hand to hand, the game took on a life of its own, and soon the kids were laughing, shouting, and treating Grant like just another player. It was during one of these games that Tara Myers approached him, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. Grant had noticed her watching him over the past few weeks, her gaze filled with a skepticism that was slowly, reluctantly giving way to something softer. "You're really putting in the effort, aren't you?" she said, her tone more curious than accusatory. Grant nodded, bouncing the ball gently against the pavement. "I have to," he replied simply. "If I want to earn back the trust I broke, I have to put in the work." Tara studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Keep it up, Officer Thorne," she said quietly. "You're on the right track." Hearing those words felt like a victory, however small. Grant knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. One day, as Grant was helping to set up a new reading corner for the kids, Reverend Brooks pulled him aside. The old man's eyes were crinkled with a smile, but there was a seriousness beneath the surface. "There's a community town hall coming up," the Reverend said. "The mayor is planning to address the recent tensions between the police and the residents. I think you should be there, Grant. People need to see that you're still here, still committed." Grant's stomach twisted with nerves at the thought, but he nodded. "I'll be there," he promised. As he watched the Reverend walk away, Grant realized something. He wasn't just doing this to prove himself to the community. He was doing it for himself too, because for the first time in years, he felt like he was becoming the kind of man he had always wanted to be. A man who could look at himself in the mirror and be proud of what he saw. And that, he realized, was the most important change of all. The cold December wind whipped through the streets of Springfield Pines, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the small town. Despite the biting cold, the community center parking lot was packed. Cars lined the street, and people bundled in heavy coats and scarves made their way towards the building. Tonight was the long-anticipated town hall meeting, a gathering where the entire community would have a chance to voice their concerns, their fears, and, Grant Thorne feared most, their anger. Grant stood outside the community center's entrance, taking in the sight of the crowd. His breath clouded the air, dissipating into the night. He had known this would be a difficult evening, but seeing the sheer number of people who had shown up made his chest tighten with anxiety. This wasn't just a town hall. It felt like a trial, and he was the one standing before the jury. "You all right?" a voice asked from beside him. Grant turned to see Reverend Calvin Brooks, his old friend and unexpected ally, throughout this ordeal. The Reverend's face was lined with concern, but there was a softness in his eyes, a quiet reassurance that Grant clung to like a lifeline. "I don't know," Grant admitted, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this." Reverend Brooks gave him a sympathetic smile. "Nobody's ever truly ready for a moment like this, Grant," he said gently. "But you're here, and that's what matters. Just be honest. Speak from the heart." Grant nodded, swallowing hard. He knew that tonight was about more than just apologizing again. It was about accountability, about standing up and listening to the voices of those he had wronged, without interruption, without excuses. As they made their way inside, the noise from the crowd grew louder. People were packed into the main hall, filling every seat and standing along the walls. The tension was palpable, like the air before a storm. Grant spotted Marcy Daniels sitting near the front, her lips pressed into a thin line. Beside her was Zeke, fidgeting nervously with the zipper of his jacket. Grant's heart squeezed painfully at the sight of the boy, who had become the unwitting center of this entire controversy. He took a deep breath and moved towards the stage, at the front of the room. The mayor, Ellen Kincaid, was already there, along with Chief Emily Reed and several other town officials. Mayor Kincaid gave Grant a tight, unreadable smile as he approached. "Officer Thorne," she said in a low voice, nodding towards the crowd. "Are you ready for this?" Grant nodded, though his stomach was in knots. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. Mayor Kincaid turned to face the crowd, raising her hands for silence. The murmuring voices gradually quieted, though the room was still filled with a palpable tension. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice clear and strong. "We're here to address the recent incident that has deeply affected our community. Tonight, we want to hear from you, from every single one of you who has felt the impact of what happened." She paused, glancing at Grant before continuing. and we'll start with Officer Thorne, who has requested to speak first." Grant felt every eye in the room turn towards him. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he thought his voice might fail him. But then he caught sight of Reverend Brooks, standing near the back, giving him a small, encouraging nod. It was enough to steady him. He stepped up to the microphone, the feedback squealing briefly as he adjusted it. He cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edges of the podium, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Good evening," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "My name is Grant Thorne, and I've been a police officer in this town for over 20 years. I've always thought of myself as someone who serves and protects this community. But recently, I made a mistake, one that has caused a lot of pain." He paused, looking down at the worn wood of the podium. The silence was thick, pressing against him from all sides. "The day I arrested Zeke Daniels, I was wrong," he continued, forcing himself to meet the eyes of the crowd. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I saw a young black boy standing alone outside a store, and I jumped to conclusions. I didn't ask questions. I didn't listen. I just assumed the worst." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of emotion that crashed against the walls of the room. Grant pressed on, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I can't undo what I did," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't take back the fear I caused, or the pain I inflicted on Zeke and his family. But I can own up to it. I can stand here and say that I was wrong, and that I am deeply, profoundly sorry." The murmurs grew louder, a mix of anger, sorrow, and something else, perhaps the faintest hint of understanding. "I've spent the past few weeks working at the community center," Grant continued. "I've listened to your stories. I've seen the distrust and fear that incidents like this create. I've learned more about this community in these weeks than I did in my 20 years as an officer. And I'm here tonight to listen again, to hear your voices, your experiences. I know I have a lot to make up for, and I want to start right here, right now." He stepped back from the microphone, the silence that followed almost deafening. For a moment it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Then, slowly, a figure stood up in the middle of the crowd. It was Tara Myers, the schoolteacher who had been one of Grant's most vocal critics. She stepped forward, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "Officer Thorne," she began, her voice loud and clear. "You say you've learned. You say you want to make things right. But how can we trust you? How can we believe that this isn't just another empty promise from someone who's trying to save his own career?" Grant felt the sting of her words, but he forced himself to nod. "You're right to ask that," he replied. "I don't expect you to trust me yet. I know trust has to be earned, and I've done a lot to break it. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it back, no matter how long it takes." Tara's eyes softened slightly, though the skepticism remained. "Then prove it," she said simply. "Prove it every day, not just tonight." Before Grant could respond, Marcy Daniels stood up, her expression as hard and unyielding as stone. "You want to listen?" Marcy demanded, her voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "Then listen to this. I had to watch my grandson cry himself to sleep for weeks. I had to explain to him why someone who's supposed to protect him made him feel like a criminal. How do you make up for that?" Grant's heart clenched painfully. He looked directly at Marcy, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I can't," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't make up for what I did to Zeke. All I can do is apologize and promise that I will do everything in my power to ensure it never happens again. To him or to any other child." Marcy's face crumpled, her hard mask breaking for the first time. She sank back into her seat, covering her face with her hands. The room was silent, the raw emotion hanging in the air like a thick fog. Then, a small voice broke through the quiet. "I forgive you," Zeke said, stepping forward. His voice was tiny, but it carried across the room, clear and pure. Grant felt the tears spill over, running down his cheeks as he looked at the boy, who had every right to hate him. He dropped to his knees, meeting Zeke's eyes. "Thank you," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what that means to me." Zeke gave him a small, tentative smile, then stepped back into his grandmother's arms. The crowd erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs, the atmosphere shifting from one of hostility to something softer, more hopeful. Reverend Brooks stepped up to the microphone, his face lit with a gentle smile. "This is what change looks like," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's messy, and it's painful, but it's necessary. Tonight, we've taken the first step towards healing. Let's continue down this path, together." As the meeting ended and people began to file out, Grant stayed behind, shaking hands and listening to the quiet words of those who approached him. He knew he had a long road ahead, filled with more hard conversations and painful truths. But for the first time he felt a glimmer of hope. He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors, his community, and he realized something important. He wasn't just a cop trying to save his career anymore. He was a man trying to make amends, trying to be better. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that he could be. The air inside the Springfield Pines Community Center was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the biting chill of winter outside. Grant Thorne walked through the main hall, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. The town hall meeting had been a turning point, and although it hadn't fixed everything, it felt like a door had opened, a door he was determined to keep walking through, no matter how tough the road became. He had woken up that morning feeling lighter, almost as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that his journey was far from over. The community had given him a sliver of hope, a chance to prove himself, but he knew it would take consistent action, day after day, month after month, to rebuild the trust he had shattered. Grant paused at the entrance to the kitchen, taking in the familiar scene. Volunteers were busy prepping for the day's lunch service, chopping vegetables, stirring large pots of soup, and arranging trays of sandwiches. It had become a routine for him, this early morning bustle that filled the room with the smells of fresh bread and simmering broth. But today the air felt different, charged with a new sense of purpose. He spotted Susan, the head volunteer, who waved him over with a cheerful smile. Her demeanor towards him had softened considerably since he'd first started showing up weeks ago, and he was grateful for the tentative friendship that was beginning to form between them. "Morning, Grant," Susan said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've got a busy day ahead. The mayor's office donated a bunch of extra supplies for today's lunch, so we're expecting a bigger crowd than usual." Grant nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "That's great news," he replied, grabbing a knife and moving to the chopping board. "Let's get to work then." As he diced onions, the rhythmic motion of the knife against the cutting board helped calm his nerves. He was glad for the distraction, glad for the chance to do something tangible. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the town hall meeting, to the faces of the people who had confronted him. Marcy Daniels' raw anger, Tara Meyer's skepticism, and most of all, Zeke's unexpected forgiveness. The image of Zeke's small, hesitant smile had stayed with him, replaying in his mind like a comforting refrain. It was a smile that held both pain and hope, and it had cracked something open inside Grant, a deep well of emotions he hadn't realized he'd been suppressing. He knew he needed to hold on to that feeling, to let it guide him as he continued this long climb towards redemption. "You've got a visitor," Susan said suddenly, pulling Grant out of his thoughts. She nodded towards the doorway, where a familiar figure stood, shifting from foot to foot with a nervous energy. It was Tara Myers, the school teacher who had been one of his harshest critics. She stepped inside the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were bracing herself against the cold, or perhaps against the uncertainty of this encounter. Grant set down his knife and wiped his hands on a towel, giving her a small, cautious smile. "Tara," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good to see you." Tara's eyes flicked to the floor, then back up to meet his gaze. "I came to talk," she said bluntly, her tone softer than he had expected. "Do you have a minute?" Grant nodded, gesturing towards a small table in the corner of the kitchen. "Of course," he replied. "Let's sit down." They took their seats, the noise of the bustling kitchen fading into the background. Tara looked down at her hands, fiddling with the strap of her purse. For a long moment she said nothing, and Grant waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say wasn't going to be easy. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the meeting," Tara began, her voice quiet. "About how you're trying to change. I wanted to believe you, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head, as if she couldn't find the right words. Grant nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "You have every reason to doubt me. I've given this community a lot of reasons not to trust me." Tara's gaze hardened slightly. "You're right," she agreed. "But the thing is, I see you here every day, working harder than anyone. You don't have to be here, and yet you are. That counts for something." Grant swallowed the lump that rose in his throat. "It does," he said softly. "But it's not enough, not yet. I know I have a long way to go." Tara leaned back in her chair, studying him with a contemplative look. "You know," she said slowly, "I used to tell my students that actions speak louder than words. That's what I'm waiting to see from you. More actions, more proof that you've really changed." Grant nodded, feeling a rush of determination. "You will," he promised. "I'm going to show you. Show this entire community that I'm committed to making things right." Tara gave him a small, almost reluctant smile. "I hope you do, Grant," she said quietly, "because we need people like you to be better. We need officers who actually care." With that, she stood up and made her way out of the kitchen, leaving Grant sitting there, staring after her. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, hope, and a deep, aching sadness for all the times he had failed to live up to the ideals she was talking about. Later that afternoon, Grant found himself on the basketball court outside the community center. It had become a regular thing now, the kids from the neighborhood gathering after school for a game, with Grant acting as a referee, a player, and sometimes just a cheerleader from the sidelines. Zeke was there too, shooting hoops with a group of older boys. Grant watched him, a smile tugging at his lips as he saw the boys' confidence growing. Zeke was laughing, his small face lit up with joy, and it warmed Grant's heart in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Hey, Zeke," Grant called, tossing a ball to him. "How about a one-on-one? First to 5 points." Zeke's eyes sparkled with excitement, but there was a flicker of hesitation too. He bit his lip, glancing at the other kids, as if he wasn't sure if he should accept the challenge. "Come on, buddy," Grant encouraged. "Let's see what you've got." Zeke grinned, his shyness melting away. He dribbled the ball a few times, then took off towards the basket with surprising speed. Grant played along, letting Zeke get past him, but then stepped up his defense, blocking the boy's shot with a playful swipe. "Not bad," Grant teased, ruffling Zeke's hair. "You're getting faster." Zeke giggled, snatching the ball back. "I almost had you, Officer Thorne," he declared, his voice filled with the kind of pure, unfiltered joy that only children seem to possess. Grant's heart clenched at the sound of it. "You did, Zeke," he said softly, bending down to meet the boy's eyes. "You really did." They played for a while longer, the sound of laughter filling the air, echoing across the empty lot. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental to Grant, a sign that things were starting to shift, that maybe, just maybe, he was on the path to earning back the trust he had broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Grant made his way back inside the community center. The day was winding down, but there were still tasks to be done. Tables to wipe, floors to sweep, and chairs to stack. He was sweeping up a corner of the hall when Marcy Daniels approached him. Grant looked up, startled to see her standing there. Her face was set in its usual stern expression, but there was something different in her eyes, a softness he hadn't seen before. "You're still here," she remarked, almost as if she couldn't quite believe it. Grant nodded, setting the broom aside. "I am," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere, Marcy." Marcy let out a long breath, crossing her arms over her chest. "I've been watching you," she admitted. "Every day you show up here, doing the work without expecting anything in return. That's more than most people would do." Grant took a step closer, his heart pounding. "I'm just trying to make things right," he said simply. Marcy's gaze softened. "Just a fraction." "I can see that," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to believe you." The words hit Grant like a physical force, filling him with a sense of relief so powerful that he felt his knees go weak. He blinked back the tears that welled up in his eyes, nodding slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Marcy gave him a small, hesitant smile, then turned and walked away, leaving Grant standing there, feeling lighter than he had in months. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. And for Grant, that was more than enough to keep going. The winter days passed by quickly in Springfield Pines, the town blanketed in a thin layer of snow that crunched underfoot and glistened like diamonds in the morning sunlight. It was a harsh season, but one that carried a quiet beauty, a reminder of nature's ability to renew itself, to cover even the roughest of surfaces with a blanket of pure white. For Grant Thorne, it felt symbolic. He was learning slowly but surely how to let the old, hardened parts of himself be softened by the changes he was making. Every morning when he arrived at the community center, he felt a small spark of hope, like the first glimmers of sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. Today the center was busier than ever. The holiday season had brought in more donations, and the kitchen was filled with the sweet, warm smells of freshly baked pies and roasted turkey. Volunteers buzzed around, packing food boxes, decorating the hall, and setting up tables for the annual winter community feast, an event that the whole town looked forward to each year. Grant wiped his hands on his apron as he helped carry a tray of steaming mashed potatoes to the serving line. It had taken him a while to get used to this kind of work, but now it felt natural, almost comforting. He liked the simplicity of it, the satisfaction of seeing a job well done. As he set the tray down, he caught sight of Susan, who was busy directing volunteers. She gave him a smile, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "You're a natural at this, Grant," she teased. "I might just make you our head chef." Grant laughed, shaking his head. "Let's not get carried away," he replied. "I still can't make a pie without burning the edges." Susan chuckled, giving him a playful nudge. "Practice makes perfect," she said. "Besides, you're doing more than just cooking. You're helping bring this community together, one meal at a time." Her words filled him with a quiet pride, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was different from the pride he used to feel in his uniform. This was deeper, rooted in the knowledge that he was making a real, tangible difference. "I'm just glad to be here," Grant said honestly. "I've learned so much from everyone, more than I ever did in my years on the force." Susan's smile softened, and she reached out to squeeze his arm. "You've changed, Grant," she said quietly. "I can see it. We all can." Before Grant could respond, a loud cheer erupted from the front of the hall. He turned to see a group of children running in, led by none other than Zeke Daniels. The boy's cheeks were flushed with excitement, and he was clutching a wrapped present tightly in his hands. "Look what I got!" Zeke shouted, holding the gift up for everyone to see. He rushed over to Grant, his eyes sparkling with joy. "Can you help me open it?" Grant knelt down, his heart swelling at the sight of Zeke's unbridled happiness. He took the gift from the boy's hands, carefully unwrapping it, to reveal a brand new basketball. Zeke let out a whoop of delight, hugging the ball to his chest. "This is amazing," he exclaimed. "Thank you, Officer Thorne." Grant's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't given Zeke the gift. He hadn't even known about it. But the boy's gratitude, his unwavering belief that Grant had something to do with it, filled him with a warmth he couldn't describe. "You're welcome, Zeke," Grant said softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "I'm glad you like it." Zeke grinned up at him, then took off towards the court outside, eager to test out his new ball. Grant watched him go, his chest tight with emotion. He knew he didn't deserve the boy's forgiveness, didn't deserve this second chance. But he was going to do everything in his power to prove that he was worthy of it. "You did good, Grant," a voice said behind him. He turned to see Reverend Calvin Brooks, his hands clasped in front of him, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Grant shook his head, his eyes still on Zeke. "I didn't give him that gift," he admitted. Reverend Brooks raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" he asked knowingly. "Maybe not directly, but your actions have given him something far more valuable, a sense of trust, a feeling of safety." Grant's eyes burned with unshed tears. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I hope you're right," he whispered. "I know I am," the Reverend replied, clapping a hand on Grant's shoulder. "You've come a long way, my friend, and it's just the beginning." The afternoon wore on, the feast in full swing. The hall was filled with laughter and conversation, the sound of children's voices mingling with the clatter of dishes and the hum of holiday music. It was the kind of scene that felt like it belonged in a movie. Perfect, almost too good to be true. Grant was ladling gravy onto plates when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Marcy Daniels, her expression as guarded as ever, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" she asked. Grant nodded, setting down the ladle. "Of course," he said. He followed her to a quieter corner of the hall, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. Marcy took a deep breath, folding her arms across her chest. "I've been watching you," she began. "I've seen the work you've put in here, the way you've treated everyone with kindness and respect. I've seen how the kids look up to you now, how they don't flinch away anymore." Grant's heart pounded in his chest. He forced himself to meet her gaze, even though it felt like standing before a judge, waiting for a verdict. "You've changed," Marcy said finally, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "And I never thought I'd say this, but I think I believe you. I believe that you're trying to be better." Grant felt his breath hitch in his throat. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was happening, he didn't know what to say. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." Marcy nodded slowly. "It doesn't mean I've forgiven you completely," she warned. "But it's a start, and it's enough for now." Grant blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently placing a hand on her arm. "That's more than I could have asked for," he said sincerely. "I'll keep working at it, Marcy. Every day, for as long as it takes." She gave him a small, tentative smile. "I know you will," she said quietly. As the sun set and the sky turned a deep, velvety blue, the feast began to wind down. Families gathered their coats, hugged their neighbors, and made their way out into the crisp winter night. Grant stood at the door, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, and accepting more than a few pats on the back. "You've done something special here, Grant," Susan said, as she joined him by the door. "This is what community looks like. This is what healing looks like." Grant looked around the room, at the faces he had come to know so well. He felt a swell of pride, not in himself, but in the people who had come together, who had shown him what it meant to be truly part of a community. "It's not just me," he said softly. "It's all of us. We did this together." Susan nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You're right," she agreed, "and that's why it's so beautiful." Later that night, as Grant walked home, the snow crunching beneath his boots, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still long, and he knew there would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and tough conversations yet to come. But he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone. He paused at the corner of the street, looking back at the community center one last time. The lights inside were still glowing warmly, like a beacon in the dark. He smiled, feeling a quiet joy spread through his chest. For the first time, Grant realized that he was no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. He had faced them, acknowledged them, and was learning to let them go. He turned and continued walking, his steps light, his heart full. This was his new beginning,